So thank you everyone for joining today's user group session. My name is Dimitri Arapetiv. I'm a partner at Turn Digital, and we help companies do a lot of things in the M365 space. And along with me, one of our co-organizers, Bill Gunning. He's the technical lead at the Massachusetts State ETOS department. So we're glad to have everyone here today. In terms of an agenda, we're going to follow our typical pattern. We're going to start off with some of the updates from M365 since the last 30 days or so, from when we've last met. Turn it over to our featured presentation. And then towards the end, we have a bit of a Q&A, an open discussion. If anyone's having problems or challenges or looking for work, looking to hire, we like to keep a little bit of the community aspect. We do have a raffle at the end, so pay attention to the presentation. There will be a raffle question based on the content presented for an Amazon gift card. And now last but not least, but after we're done with the educational part of this, we tend to go to a bar around the corner and have a beer or two and talk without it being recorded. So that being said, the last session that we did was actually I presented. It was on the top features coming in 2023. We have that posted on YouTube. So if you've missed it, it's a very fast-paced presentation of about 60 slides, each slide about 30 seconds long, explaining what's coming and why you should be excited about it. So let's talk a little bit about the updates since last time. So SharePoint 2013 workflows are officially being retired in the next year or so. So starting next year, they're going to be turned off by default for any new tenants. And then starting a few years after that, they will stop functioning. So many of you have gone through this process with SharePoint 2010 designer workflows. And when it stopped working, you saw a lot of fires. Microsoft does provide a tool to scan your environment to identify these SharePoint designer workflows that you might still have. So if you don't have a plan to address those SharePoint designer workflows yet, this is a good time to start looking at it. Another feature that was announced at Ignite last fall was around the ability to come into your SharePoint site and see what administrative changes have occurred in the last 30 days. So if something's different about the site or somebody's working on a site and wasn't quite sure what the previous administrator did, you'd be able to quickly track what settings and invitations and other changes have been made there. So that functionality is now rolling out, and as long as you have a SharePoint Syntax license, you'll be able to access this functionality. Next coming up, so Microsoft is continuing to improve the UX around the SharePoint page design for the content creators. So they are introducing additional views of existing web parts. They're also introducing additional abilities to change your text size, colors, fonts, the whole 9 yards in context, as opposed to using that right panel flyout. So keep an eye out for those coming to your environment soon. The next feature is around SharePoint templates. So Microsoft is releasing 3 new SharePoint templates. So one is a new home site template. So many of us have built intranets. Microsoft has decided to package the most commonly used features of an intranet homepage and deploy that as a new template. There's also a new template for Brand Central. So your marketing or communications department can really put your brand assets in one place and showcase them to your employees so they know how to use them within the proper guidelines. And then last but not least is a new template tied to Microsoft Syntax. So this is going to give you the ability to have the accounts payable template where you can drag and drop an invoice and it will automatically extract who it's for, when it's due, what the amount is, and all the other relevant metadata for you. So this is all rolling out middle of this month. So for many of you, this should already be in your environment. For others, it'll get there before the end of the month. Next update, so Microsoft Syntax is rolling out some new features to iOS and Android devices, specifically features around being able to split and combine PDF files while on the go. So if you have Adobe Acrobat, you could do this using Acrobat, but if you don't have an Acrobat license, but you're part of Syntax, you'll have the ability to use the apps on your phone to do the same thing. So next feature that is coming out very soon is the ability to use your MFA authenticator inside of the Outlook app on your mobile devices. So if your users have Outlook on their device, but they have not downloaded the MFA app and enrolled with that QR code process, pretty soon they'll be able to just use the Outlook app to go and plug in their MFA code instead of having to install another application for it.
I have a question again.
Sure, good.
Is this authenticator inside Outlook only good for Microsoft, like personal Microsoft event, or it's also good for, say, MongoDB?
Yeah, great question. So this feature is not rolled out yet. It's coming out next month.
Yeah.
So at that point, we'll probably have more documentation around the use cases it supports. Typically with these announcement cycles, they're announcing what the capabilities will be. But then all the details get filled in closer to the rollout time period. But the key thing for now is that if you don't want your users to be able to have this feature, there is an activity you could take before May 26th to disable this in your environment. Good. All right, next features is related to Teams. So Microsoft has been redoing the user experience around OneDrive in the browser in the last few months. They're pushing a similar type of experience within the Files app inside of Teams, where you're going to be able to see things that have been shared with you, things that you've shared out, be able to sort based on recent activity, meaning if you've been, at mentioned and within a file comment, or if you've recently modified a file. So the same thing that you would see in the web will now have a better experience inside of Teams. The next thing is Microsoft has been rebuilding the Teams app for Windows. At least.
I have a question online from Tim Roberts.
Okay, Tim, go ahead.
I was just in the context of Teams now. One of the little interesting things I've found is between the Mac and Windows, using Teams not only for the work but also for personal. I've had some issues on my Mac where I haven't had it on Windows. I just wondered if anybody else has had similar sharing or had similar problems going between personal and the work Teams.
Tim, that's a great question. Let's park that until we get to the community help section towards the end of today's meeting.
Okay,
that could lead to more topics.
Okay.
Absolutely. So Microsoft has been rebuilding the Teams client from the ground up for Windows. Microsoft's goal is to make it more efficient, make it load faster, and they've achieved making this work twice as fast using half the resources. So with this whole rebuild, it's a lot more fluid, and the preview is publicly available. So if you have the preview capabilities turned on in your Teams policy at your tenant level, your users will be able to toggle that on and try the new experience. If you haven't done so, it's, I found it to be very fast, but this will also be rolled out into the general, the public audience later this year. Next in public preview is the new avatars function for Teams. So this was also announced last year, where instead of having the camera on and sharing your actual face, Microsoft has found that a lot of people spend more time looking at themselves than paying attention to meetings. So they are introducing the ability to have an avatar that would still mimic your smiles, your hand raises, motions, gestures, etc. But the main difference is that it doesn't actually show your face. It shows an avatar rendering of your face. This has been in private preview for a while. We're happy to see that it's now in public preview. And the same thing applies as on the last slide, where you need to turn on those public preview features on your tenant level, and then users will be able to select that when they are in the environment. So another feature is around collaborative meeting notes. So typically within a meeting, you have an agenda, you have a list of topics that you're discussing or making decisions upon, and then you have follow-on tasks that emerge as action items from your meetings. So Microsoft is now making it easy to share your agendas in advance, cover the meeting notes that you can collaborate with the attendees in real time while the meeting is progressing, and then derive automatically action items that could be assigned to people using To-Do, Planner, or your favorite task option within the platform. So Microsoft is getting a little bit more intelligent for what we're doing in meetings instead of taking a bunch of notes and then later coming back and trying to take actions upon them. And this is going to be in the preview release coming out soon, and it's going to be in the standard release by the end of the summer. I'd like to give a quick thank you to the company I work for, Turn Digital. They provide the food and operating costs for the user group, so thanks to them. So that all being said, we have our main event, which is querying Power BI REST APIs within a Power BI dataset with John Kursky. So John, take it away.
Afternoon. Can you hear me all right, Dimitri?
That was great.
All right, wonderful. Well, hello, everyone. I'm very excited about the Teams updates, especially if it's going to mean I don't have as much RAM being used on my computer. So that's going to be a welcome gift when that comes out in GA. So today we're going to talk about querying Power BI REST APIs within a Power BI data set. I know this is not necessarily SharePoint or Teams focused, but if you're doing a lot of SharePoint lists and you're taking Power BI data or Power BI and bringing in SharePoint list data. It's going to be a big help to see how this can help you kind of manage your data sets and manage your refreshes with a capability that isn't provided by Microsoft out of the box today. So a little bit about me. I've been working in the Microsoft BI stack for 11 plus years. I actually started out doing a lot of SharePoint development. So started working in SharePoint 2003, got all the way up to SharePoint Online, and then came across Power Pivot for SharePoint, and then fully graduated over Microsoft Power BI when that came out. So a lot of what I'm going to go over today is kind of based on my experience with Power BI, but also from a project manager perspective, just after having to manage lots of workspaces and data sets and data refreshes, was trying to find a way that our teams could manage the environments a little easier, whether or not you were a tenant admin or if you were just coming into a large enterprise and you were given a couple workspaces and you needed to kind of keep an eye on how everything's going. Now, the QR code on the screen is the slides. You can download those, or up on GitHub. So the hyperlinks that I'll provide in the slides, it should be accessible, as well as the QR codes. And then any code that I'm going to share today, I either have templates on my GitHub page, as well as the custom connectors that I'm going to show you are MIT licensed. It's open source. So if you're trying to get any of these custom connectors to work within your organization and you're not a tenant admin and your admin wants to see the code and review it or do security scans, it's all open source. They can do that today. All right. So specifically today, I want to talk a little bit about, for those who don't know what REST APIs are in the context of Power BI, what those are. The challenges we have as folks working in the Power Platform, trying to access Power BI REST APIs, introduce you to the custom connector, and then I promise I won't be doing a lot of slides. We're going to do quite a few demos so you get an understanding of how to use the connector, as well as some free templates that you can get started, whether or not you work in the Azure or commercial environment, or if you're working in the government community cloud. And then I'll give you some advice on next steps on how to move forward with implementing that in your own environment. All right, so Power BI REST APIs. Lots of acronyms there. So the first one I want to point out is REST. So REST is the representational state transfer, which is a implementation of what was, I think, graduated from what we used to call SOAP calls. This became a different way of implementing what we call application programming interfaces, or APIs. This is really to take away the middleman of information. So pretty much anytime we're working with an application here with Teams, or you're working with Power BI in the service, or you're working with SharePoint, under the hood, the code is actually calling APIs to get information and send information to save state or save files, or get you the latest refresh information from your Power BI service. So this is REST APIs are really for system-to-system communication. But what's really nice about APIs is that if you know there's one there, not only can you build a UI on top of it, like Microsoft has done with Power BI, but you can also tap into it yourself to do analytics and take a look at that information that's coming over the wire. So what can you get out of the Power BI REST APIs? So I'm going to just pull up the website real quick. Zoom in. So the Power BI REST APIs on the Microsoft Learn site, they kind of boil it down to Power BI REST APIs let you manage Power BI content, perform admin operations, and embed Power BI content. Zoom out here, zoom back in. There's a bunch of information that you can glean out of the Power BI REST APIs. I'm going to give you just kind of a snapshot of what kind of information you can get, which would be in the sense of dataset information. So if you're familiar with Power BI, you usually are working with in desktop. When you publish something to the Power BI service, it actually creates two things. You usually have a dataset and a Power BI report. The dataset is what you refresh. The API can give you information about what data sources are used to build that data set. You can also get information on the refresh history, at least notionally, I think the last like 30 to 60 different refreshes. You can get a history of which ones have done well, which ones have failed, which ones are in progress. You can get what the refresh schedule is. So if you're using in the Power BI service a way to set up like the every half an hour or every hour kind of refresh, you can actually get that information over the API. You can also, with the a recent update they made in the last year and a half, you can actually issue a query against that data set over the API, which is pretty cool. And I'll show you how to do that using the custom connector here in a second. You can also get an idea of how many reports are connected to certain data sets. If you're trying to inventory how many pages you've made or how many tabs in your Power BI report, you can get that as well. And you can also get an idea of like workspaces and who has access to your workspaces. If you're using deployment pipelines with Power BI Premium, you can get the history of the deployments that were moving from dev test to prod. So this is really helpful as an administrator if you want to know, like, well, who moved that to production or who moved that to test, or when that was moved to test. Let me clarify. When that was moved to test, you at least have an idea. You can also get an idea of who has access to your pipelines. And then if you're using apps, you can get some general information about what you have, what apps are out there, and what reports, data sets, dashboards, or data flows are associated with your apps. Honestly, the one piece of this API, and there's a lot of PowerBIideas.com requests out there to Microsoft, is getting more endpoints into the app feature. So things like what we don't have today, which would be really nice, is getting a list of all the user access requests to your Power BI app. If you work with SharePoint and you're familiar with how folks ask for information or request to your SharePoint site, there's an API in SharePoint to get that information, which makes it easy to kind of monitor who's requesting access to your SharePoint sites. You can't do the same thing in a Power BI today. But at least you can, from the app perspective, kind of understand what's in your app and what content's in there right now. Now, Microsoft's done a really good job of exposing that API on a lot of different platforms. So if you want to connect and get that data set information, they have a PowerShell library for it. If you want to build a web application that embeds a Power BI report and then you want to issue a data set refresh remotely or pull in 2 reports, you can do that in JavaScript. They have a library in that. They have one for React. They have a general JavaScript library as well. There's a .NET wrapper for the Power BI REST APIs. There's even a Python library out there for Power BI. And from the Power Platform perspective, you can do that in Power Automate as well. It's not as covers as many endpoints, but if I go over here to a Power Automate flow and I go to new steps and I type in Power BI, hopefully this comes up fairly quickly. You can see there's a bunch of different options that I can connect, and all under the hood, this is actually calling the Power BI REST API to either export data, or if you want to refresh a data set through Power Automate, that's available to you as well in Power Automate. The funny thing is while Power Automate can get it, and you can actually connect to it in Power Apps as well, we don't have that capability in Power BI. So everyone else gets it, but if you want to build a Power BI report that pulls some information from the Power BI REST API, if you were to try to do that out of the box today, you don't have that capability. So for Power BI users who kind of want to understand how their environment's operating, or just get some statistics about how the Power BI data sets are refreshing as a workspace admin, you don't have that capability. You can go into the service and click on every data set and maybe see how the refresh is going on. But I mean, Power BI is there to do some of the analytics for you. If you could just pull in that data, you could see that information, you could aggregate, see how long it takes on average for your data set to refresh, or how many failures and refreshes are you having in the last couple days. That's what Power BI is there to provide you those analytics, but you just can't tap into that data set, especially as a workspace admin. So from my team that I work with, we have very large project teams to very small project teams, but often what we find ourselves in is at least you're a workspace administrator, meaning you're not a Power BI administrator and you have kind of carte blanche access to the Power BI environment, but you're responsible enough that, or you're responsible for multiple workspaces, and you really would just like to inventory the workspaces that you manage. I can't tell you how many times I've had clients come up to me and they're trying to produce reports, or we're trying to show some sort of statistics for the client where they just want to see, well, like, how many data sets are you managing? How many reports did you put out last week? How many do we have in production? Having to manually count that is not a good way of practice. You want to have an automation there. We also want to monitor for issues. Often as we're working with Power BI data sets, the refreshes, when they fail, they get emailed to folks. I've seen emails go to the wrong people. People leave the company, or they end up in the unfocused Outlook part of their inbox, and then they don't see the issues. We'd like to centralize some of the monitoring of the data set refreshes so that if you're managing a Power BI environment, we're kind of eating our own dog food, and where we have our own dashboard to monitor our multiple dashboards and the refreshes, so that we know if there's an issue with the data sets, we know that quicker than waiting for an email or hoping that the email actually gets to the right person. And then we also want to maintain a comprehensive refresh schedule. Often when we're working in geographically dispersed environments, let me show you. If you go to your schedule refresh, and I was like to turn this on, there's nothing that stops somebody from picking a different time zone. And so you might have people who set up data refreshes in Pacific time, or they're over running it in UTC if they're over in Europe, and you're running it in Eastern time for a couple of your data set refreshes. Well, how do you kind of merge everything together so you have a nice way of seeing all your refreshes in a time zone that you can kind of look at chronologically? That's not necessarily there. You got to check every data set. You got to look to see what time zone it is, and then do the mental math to see how many hours you have to go in. And then, oh, by the way, you got to add daylight savings, and it just makes it a whole mess. Where the API can give you that information, you can kind of consolidate that. And that's really helpful when maybe you have maintenance windows and you know they're going to take down a database, or the network's going to be down for a little while, and you won't be able to access some of the resources. And you kind of need to know, well, what data sets are going to fail. If you knew what the whole schedule was, you have a good idea of how everything, what things are going to break. So with those kind of use cases in mind, we didn't have a way to do it in Power BI natively. And so teammates and I, we put together an open source connector, and we looked out what's out there in the community now. And there's a couple of Power BI connectors out there, but what we really struggled with is having all the available data to us, plus having it available both for commercial and the GCC environments. And so we put together a Power Query connector to the PBI REST API that's available on GitHub right now through the commercial, or you can download this if you're running in a GCC environment as well. Now, some of you may ask, well, why do you have one for commercial and one for GCC? The difference is there's different endpoints when we need to authenticate to the Power BI REST API, and those have to be hard-coded into the custom connector in order for the authentication to work. So the URL that authenticates you in the commercial environment is different from the GCC environment. And so we needed to make sure that we had both of those available. All right, so enough of presentations. Let's dive into the demos. So in order to use a custom connector, whether it's this one or any custom connector that you might come across out in the community or you purchase, you have to set up your Power BI desktop first. So I'm going to open Power BI desktop, and what you'll need to do is you'll go to your file, and then you'll go to options and settings, and you're going to click on options. And hopefully this opens up fairly quickly. I haven't upgraded to the latest version of Teams, so there we go. So what you'll need to do is under the global settings, you're going to want to go to the security section. And once you click on this security section, you'll want to go to where it says data extensions, and you'll have to click the allow any extensions without validation or warning. Now, again, you take this at face value in terms of when you are bringing in your own custom connector, you need to understand what it's doing and what it accesses. Now, in the case of the custom connector that we're offering that's out on GitHub, you can see the code, you can compile it, you can take a look to see if it's making any external connections, and you can run security code scans on it too if you need to. But once you click this button and then you hit OK, if this is the first time that you're doing it, you're going to have to close Power BI. You only have to do this once on this machine, and then you'll open Power BI again. And then at that point, the custom connector settings that you just set from the security standpoint will have taken hold. So just keep in mind, you got to open it up the first time, go to security, set the data extensions to the allow any extensions, and then close Power BI in order for the settings to take effect. So once you have that, the next thing you need to do is actually get the custom connector. So I'm going to go out to the website that I had the QR code for. And there is one for the REST API, and for the purpose of the demo, I'm going to use the commercial version, not the GCC version. You can go to the releases section here and pull down the latest version of the Power BI data, the MES file. And so when you download that, you're going to want to save that to a location, and I'm going to show you where you want to save that file. So for many of you who, whether you're installing, have Power BI installed through the App Store or through just the push through by your company through an executable, you usually have within your either OneDrive account or your C Drive account a Power BI desktop folder, and then there will be a folder called Custom Connectors. Now, if that folder for Custom Connectors isn't there, you can actually just create it. You just make sure that you spell it right, custom space connectors with an S, and then you will put the .mes file in that folder. And so again, you're going to want to keep Power BI closed while you're doing this, because what actually happens in the background is when Power BI loads the first time, it actually will check this folder to see if there's any .mez files, and then load those into as an option for the get data. So again, you're going to want to keep the Power BI desktop closed, and then drop this file into your custom connectors, and then you can open up Power BI. All right, so let's say you've run through that process. We've set all the options in Power BI desktop. We've downloaded the .mes file. We put it in the right folder. Now we can actually go and get the data. So what you'll do is you'll click the Get Data options in Power BI desktop. And hopefully this pulls up fairly quickly. It's running a little quicker for me this morning. Okay, there we go. And you can click on the other category, and you're going to see here there is a connect to PBI REST API. Have a little icon there with different shades of yellow to connect to. Now, if you pull in if you're in the GCC environment and you pull in the MES file, it will say connect to PBI REST API GCC instead of the commercial environment. So what you'll do then is you can click on the item, hit connect. Now, the first time you connect to any third-party custom connector, you're going to get a prompt saying whether or not you want to use it. This is Microsoft's way of making sure they don't get sued, having this message up there. If you click on this link, this will take you to the GitHub site, takes you to the README file, which explains how to use the custom connector. You can hit continue, and then if this is the first time you're using the custom connector, you're going to get asked to sign in. So if you click the sign in button, this is going to be very similar to importing data from a SharePoint list online. You're going to get a prompt pop up to log into your Office 365 account. Once you're signed in, you're going to hit connect. And on the left-hand side here, you're going to get a laundry list of all the functions or the API endpoints that you can access in the service. Now, this list can be quite overwhelming, so I'll walk through kind of my best practice and pulling the data in. But if you are curious as to what each function does, in the README file, there is a section called Functions Implemented. And this goes into each one of the functions, the Microsoft documentation, and what information you'll get out of it. So it kind of gives you a synopsis there. I'm going to flip back over to Power BI real quick. And what I typically do is if I'm setting up my connection for a data set for the first time, I'll just click on the Get Apps just to see if I get some data back. And you're going to see it comes back actually not as a table, but as JSON. Now, you may wonder, okay, well, why don't you just give me a table of data instead of the JSON, which I'm going to have to parse? Well, we learned after a couple of trials and errors that whether you're working in the commercial environment or the GCC environment, Microsoft tends to add new properties in the JSON files. And every time you would parse that, you'd have to make a very explicit decision on like, oh, I want the description or I want the publish by, which means that when you compile the custom connector, it's set in stone. And if they were to add a new property, which they did recently with like deployment history, you would have to recompile the .mes file. And we didn't really want to have to do that and push out updates. We just really want what the JSON that's coming back, and we can parse it in Power BI. And then we also noticed that between the commercial environment and the GCC environment, the JSON that comes back is very different for some of the endpoints. And that's because it takes some time for the same type of features that are in the commercial environment to make their way into the government community cloud. So we kind of made a decision that the data that's going to come back for the most part is going to be in JSON. And then I'm going to show you how to parse that yourself. And then so that way, if a new property comes in, instead of having to wait for a new version of the .mes file to come out, you just go into your data set and then you update the expand record and you can identify the new property that's available. All right, so enough of talking about design decisions. You have the get apps is what you're going to want to click on. And then the next thing you're going to want to do is go to transform data. And my Power Query window opened up in my other monitor. So let me just drag that over. All right, so you can see here that we've got the JSON that came back from calling the get apps in the Power BI API. And this gives me the list of all the apps I have access to in my workspace. So we're actually going to delete this step and delete this step. And nice here is actually a catalog of all the functions that of import. We tried to set it up that you can just pull in a catalog of the functions and then you can pick which ones you want to use. And what I would recommend doing is the first time you're setting this up, go ahead and rename that table. I just call it like function catalog. You right click and unclick enable load. That way the table doesn't show up in your data set. It'll sit just in Power Query. You don't really want to expose this to the to the end users if they're trying to look at the data set in the report windows. So once you have that catalog built, then you can actually pick which kind of functions you want to use. And you'll notice that near the bottom, there is a description also embedded in every one of those functions. So if I want to get what reports are in my app, you can see what it returns. But we're going to start off with a different one here, the get groups. So long ago, several years ago, when Microsoft first came out with Power BI, they associated Office 365 groups with Power BI workspaces. And so the underlying endpoint to get the workspaces for Power BI is actually called get groups. So if I want to identify all the workspaces I have access to, or just filter a list of it, what you can do is under the function here, just right click, go to add as new query, and then the function actually gets created for you to be able to call in your environment here. And we have set up the functions to actually have documentation, so you can see what kind of function or what kind of parameters you can pass into this and what information you can get out of it. For get groups, you can actually just call, there's a couple different ways. If you maybe want to just get all the groups, you just leave this blank. For the purpose of what I'm going to show you, I'm going to put in a query that's going to just get one workspace back. So it's a custom connector test is the name of my workspace. And you can see it came back with the JSON, and it's got the identification for the custom connector test. So the next thing you want to do is like, okay, I can't really deal with the JSON. I need to parse it. So up at the top here, you've got the ability to parse that JSON data. I'm going to click on that, parse it, and then there's a couple steps. You'll click on the list. The value is what actually has the content you need. You convert that to a table. And as soon as it pops up here, I say, yep, I want to convert this to a table. And now if I expand, you can see it has all the properties for that workspace. I got the ID, I got whether it's read-only, I've got whether it's on a dedicated capacity, what the capacity ID is, the name, and the workspace type. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this table to workspaces, and I'm going to rename this column to workspace ID. So now that I have a list of the workspaces, maybe I want to get all the data sets in that workspace. So if you go back to the function catalog, this is where you can start chaining the functions together to really get the information to help you build your inventories or the data set that you really need to manage or monitor your environment. So I've got a get data set in group function. If I right click on that and hit add as new query, you can see I've got the new function here. And you can actually call that function in Power BI as a custom invoke add column. So up here at the top, if I click on add column, there's a option to invoke the custom function. And I can click that. Let's say I want to call that datasets call. I want to pick the function that I want. That's not the function I want. Hold on. Get datasets in groups. So when I invoke that, I should get the option. I don't know why it's not giving me the other option to hit that function. Huh. Of course, it's a demo, and I'm trying to get datasets in groups. Not quite sure why it's not letting me invoke the other function here. That's weird. Maybe I need to click out real quick. Doing like I should see it as a drop-down menu here. I'm going to hit OK real quick, and then we can actually do this in the M code up here. So if I call get dataset in group and I want to pass in the workspace ID, this should work. Oh, and like wants me to close that out. I must have done something wrong when I pulled in that data. So since this is a demo, I already have something baked up for you all. As I've walked through this process, when you see the data that's coming back and you're wondering, okay, John, you went through a lot of steps to get that information. Like, what do I need to do in order to like make this a little easier? Or maybe if I watch this YouTube video and I want to walk through this again, what kind of templates are out there that could help me get started? So there is a template that I provided in the presentation. You can actually access it on this site, Power PBI Data Ops Monitoring. There is a template out there that you can download. And when you open up that template, you're going to get something that looks like this. If it will. There we go. And what this template does is you point it to your workspaces, and it will actually pull in the information for your workspaces and tell you some general information on any data set you have unscheduled, refresh failures, refresh stalls, that data sets that are taking longer than 2 hours to refresh, and any data flows that are failing. But if you want to kind of understand how to use the custom connector, you can actually click the transform button in the Power Query window. Here we go. Hold on just a second. Just got to drag it over. All right. So I've given you a lot of examples on how to pull in the information. So here we've got our custom connector data set that I've parsed, very similar to what I showed you, just with a basic version earlier. Then from the workspace connector, you can see I actually start with the workspace. I invoke the custom function, which is actually working this time. It parses the JSON data, and then what you end up getting after a couple of these steps is a list of all the data sets, as well as the URLs to those data sets and where they're located. And then this version of the template just keeps building on top of each successive data set. So now that I have all my data sets, I can actually look at all the data set refresh history. And so I can actually see all the times that the data sets have actually been refreshed, how they were refreshed, their start times and their end times. And then you can actually start building out the time that it takes to refresh those data sets. And then with that information, you can actually start building out data set refresh statistics. And so you can actually see how often it takes your data sets to refresh. And then you can also take a look at any of the upcoming refreshes that you have, which I don't think I have any scheduled in this example, but let me just pull this up real quick. You can see upcoming data set refreshes, which I don't have any in here, but what it will do in this data set is actually figure out all the time zones that you have and then merge those together, and then you can choose which time zone you want. And so the beauty of having the Power BI REST APIs is I can figure out what time zones were set for each one of those refreshes. I can figure out the days and times that they want to have it, and then you can pull that information in and see it in one time zone in one data set to tell you what's when the refresh schedule is going to happen. I think that Bill, you had a question? Somebody's hand was up.
Okay, I just had a quick question. So first of all, I have a couple of questions. The MES file, it's different for GCC than it is for a commercial?
That's correct. Really the only difference in it is there's 2 lines of code that tell you what endpoint in the Office 365 authentication points to. It goes to a .gov address instead of a dot.
If I download yours, I could just tweak those 2 lines.
Oh, there is a GCC version out there. So if you go to the site, the QR code that I have on the it should take you to the GCC version. It is this one right here, Power Query Connector PBI REST API GCC.
And then the other question I had, just looks like the capacity metric monitor, like Microsoft released, what's it called? They have an app that monitors if you have a premium capacitor. So it's kind of like you're doing all this, but on workspaces, on the pro license and the premium license. Is that your model for like this, for the data you were trying to drive?
Yeah, so that's a great question. If you are trying to do statistics at the tenant level, or you're managing it from a premium capacity, stuff like workspace analytics or log analytics with that premium Power BI report is going to give you the long-term analysis of your premium environment. What this connector is really intended to do is help the workspace admins understand their environments. So a lot of times in big enterprises, you might not have it just yet where you have a central kind of data lake that has all the premium capacity information for people to tap in. Then you got to add RLS to it, row level security, so people can't see other people's workspace information. Whereas if you just give them the connector, it's going to use their credentials when it goes to authenticate, and then they're just going to access the information they have. And it's a nice kind of bootstrap for the workspace admins to be able to do the analysis they want to do within their own workspaces, as opposed to trying to build a huge environment just to tap into monitoring dataset refreshes across the enterprise if you want to try to provide that as a service. Sometimes that just isn't feasible, and in other times it might take a while to get that capability there. This gives you kind of that in-between capability where maybe you just need to give workspace admins the ability to build their data sets, or you're going to build something in log analytics eventually, but you need to give them something in the intermediate to be able to run some of the analytics they have in their workspaces.
And I think it's great, and it fills a good gap where the other one from Microsoft only allows you to look at your premium capacitor. So this allows you to look at the other reports. So I really like it. But thanks. I just wanted to illustrate that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So there is a couple caveats on implementing this. Since this is a custom connector, if you want to run this in the Power BI service, you are going to need to make sure you have a gateway set up. Now, for larger organizations, there's usually a Power BI gateway available, and you just need to, if you're running a personal gateway, you can run this locally. But if you're running a Power BI gateway as part of your service for your organization, you would just put those .mes files in the connector folder, and then folks can you walk through your normal process of registering the Power BI custom connectors. Registering a gateway connection in your service like you would a SQL database that's on-prem. From a security perspective, when you set up that connection, the person who signs in with that connector is going to be the credentials that gets used. So it's just like a SharePoint online list. When you set up a workspace, it's going to use that person's credentials to query the information. So whoever is setting up the connector, that instance, and they sign in, just keep in mind that if they don't have access to that workspace or they don't have access to that data set, if they're building in the connector and they're pulling in information and they don't see anything come in, it's because they don't have access to it. So you just have to keep in mind that it's using OAuth. So it's just like a SharePoint list or any of the other OAuth connectors in Microsoft. That's the credential that gets used when you set up the connectors in the service. All right. So, Dimitri, I could show a couple more demos, but I know we're coming up at the top of the hour. I just want to be respectful of the time. I can open it up to questions as well if anybody's got any.
Sure, John. I mean, time-wise, another 30 minutes would be great. But
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's hope the Power BI thing behaves this time. But what I want to show you is it's actually querying. You can actually query data, another data set within a Power BI data set. And so I'm going to preface that when you do this, keep in mind that you can always run into performance issues. Trying to call one data set to another is really only relegated to maybe certain scenarios in which maybe you need to pull data in, a small set of data, so you can do an analysis, and you don't want to do composite models, or you need to call on behalf of somebody else, and that data set's only accessible to a trusted party. Just keep in mind that when you're calling this to another data set, you're making this call. Don't try to circumvent security. Just keep in mind that when you call that data and you're bringing in, it's just like bringing other data in. You just want to be mindful of who you're exposing that data set to. So I have a data set out in the service. Let's see, called sample model. And if I have a premium per user or a premium capacity, you usually get a service connection where you can query that data remotely. And so if I have DAX Studio here, one of my favorite tools to use, and I try to connect, go to a new connection. So I'm going to go to that URL out there to connect to that data set. So I see the question, what kind of queries can you run against the data set? So pretty much you can run any DAX query against the data set. For those who are familiar with dynamic management views, there is a subset of those. You can always send me a message after this meeting if you're interested in getting that list. I publish which ones aren't available. But if you can query it in your own Power BI file, and it's DAX, you can query this data set through the REST API. So I'm going to just pull in this Marvel fact table, which is just a test data set that I've built from some 538 data out on GitHub. And you can see when I run that query, it should bring back just a table of data. So let's say I want to bring that data into my data set, and there's a very unique case that I need to connect to a small, bring it in so I can mash it up with my other data. Well, there is a execute query function in the catalog of, let me just close some of these here. Okay, there we go. I have a catalog here for the sample file, and there's an execute query in function right here. This is the one that you can call DAX remotely through the Power BI REST API. And so if I add this as a new query, you're going to see there's a lot of information about how that query works. But what you want to do is you need to understand what the dataset ID is, and then you got to write the DAX query itself. So if I go back to the service, the dataset ID is actually up here. So if I copy that, go back to the function, paste that in, and then if I go to the DAX formula that I had written here, copy that and put it into the DAX query and hit invoke. Hopefully the demo gods are good to me. You're going to see that I actually get a JSON representation of that table. What the execute query does is you can send multiple queries. and you get back a bunch of tables. So the next couple steps I'm going to show you are a little arduous. You just kind of have to drill down all the way to the bottom. You can see right here, if you're familiar with JSON, let me zoom in real quick. It's got results, tables, rows. And so the next couple steps I'm going to show you in Power Query, it's just to get to that specific item in the array. So I'm going to parse the JSON. I'm going to get into the list. I'm going to convert this to a table. Nice thing is once you do this the first time, you'll never have to do it again. Now I've got the records. Now it's going to ask me, do I want to expand the table? Now I'm actually getting to the point where I can access the table that got returned. There's multiple tables that can get returned. And then now I've got the rows. And then finally, I can expand that to new rows. Now I've got all that data as a table. And so now the same query that I ran in DAX Studio against the data set remotely, if I know the data set and I have the right DAX query, I can actually issue that query as well. Now just keep in mind, you only want to use this under certain scenarios on combining data, but especially for certain situations, this is really helpful. What's also helpful for this kind of information is for those who have ever worked with dynamic management views, there is, especially from a developer standpoint, you can get information about the data set that you're working with. So if you want to understand, I think it's called, hold on just a second. It's over here. There's a couple things under the TM schema that you can actually query remotely. Not all of them are available, but if you want to understand all the tables that you have, all the M code that you're running underneath the hood, this is really another way that you can get that information as well. And then on my one of my public Power BI data sets, I actually give a list of which one of these queries are actually available through the execute query capability. There's been several Power BI ideas trying to push to try to get this information, make every one of those endpoints available. But this is really nice if you want to kind of do a quick, let's say you wanted to look at all the M code that you have and see if any of the, there's any errors in your tables. So sometimes when you refresh a data set, if you get an error, it actually creates an error table. Well, you could actually run a scan using this execute query feature, get the data, see if any of the table names start with the word errors, and then track that as well. And you can look across multiple data sets to do that as well. So instead of having to open up every data set to see if you've run into any runtime issues with errors, you can do that. And those errors tables are a good indicator, especially if you're managing data sets, of maybe there's been some changes in the data that you have, or somebody changed an upstream data set, and where you were casting a column from a number to text, and now you've got a bunch of like dates that are showing up in that column and they don't cast right, you're going to get errors that show up for those specific new rows of data, and those get pushed to an errors in table, and you want to know about that. The data set actually refreshes just fine, but you get these errors that come back. All right. So let me walk through the the custom connector real quick. Actually, let me stop there. Is there any questions about the execute query? I think Russell had a question. So if I create a data flow that creates a new data set, I can use Power BI REST API forms Power BI to query that data. Power BI forms Power BI to query that data. Yes, I think technically, if the idea is that you use the custom connector to build a data set, Power Apps has a way that you can query that Power BI data, either through the native connector or their own custom connector at this point.
Can I come off mute for a minute and
Yeah.
clarify my question?
Yeah.
I'm working on a project, and we got data in SQL Server. I'm moving it all into SharePoint list so I can query it freely from Power Apps without paying license fees. And the thought occurred to me that if I created a Power BI data flow that took all that data and dumped it into a Power BI data set, can I use the Power BI REST API from Power Apps to query that data that is sitting in that data set?
So
Does that make sense to you?
yeah. So if you're running just a standard license, this is at least my understanding, there's a native way from Power Apps to I think you can get some data out of the Power BI data set. If you want to call multiple APIs, you have to use there's a confusion. You can build a custom connector for Power BI, but you can also build a custom connector for Power Apps and Power Automate. They're two separate things. If you want to touch any of those different endpoints that don't provide the same type of functionality as the native, that's a premium capability.
Okay.
So let's say that the native connector gave you some information about the data, but you need to do XYZ and there's no function available in the native one. Well, if you can create a custom connector in Power Apps and Power Automate and you hit that endpoint, they'll let you create it, but as soon as you connect your Power Apps to it, there's usually a little premium things in parentheses that says like you're going to need a premium license to make that connection.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So Russell, you also mentioned data flows, and this is something to point out. This custom connector at this point is only available to data sets, and if you have your data or your custom connector registered in the gateway, your data sets can refresh from the service. Microsoft does have it on their roadmap, and I thought they said it was going to come out in March. I have yet to see it get announced. Maybe we wait till next month during the Power Platform Conference. But they are going to introduce eventually a capability where the data flow itself can also use a custom connector that's registered in the gateway. So everything that I was showing you in a data set eventually will also be available for data flow, and it can make the same kind of calls and get the data as long as you have the custom connectors registered in a gateway. But that's something that it's on the roadmap. It said it was going to be released in March. I haven't seen any news on it, but I'm hoping before the end of the year that capability will be there.
Good to know. Thank you.
Yep. All right. Questions? All right. So last kind of demo I want to just cover is if you are interested in Power BI monitoring and you tend to use other Power Automate to run your refreshes, or you want to just know if your Power Automate flows are actually running correctly. We have another custom connector out there that's also open source. It is for Power Automate, and you have access to the schedules and the refresh runtimes for your Power Automate flows. And so I'm going to show you what that looks like, hopefully, if my environment behaves correctly. I'm going to open up a template. So with the Power BI monitoring link that I've sent you, there's a couple different options. We have the commercial version, the GCC version, and then there's the ones without Power Automate, GCC, and commercial versions. And so if you have the custom connector for Power BI and the custom connector for Power Automate, you can use these templates in your environment. And I'm going to download that real quick and open it up just to kind of show you what we can do. This is really nice, especially a couple of the projects that we run where if we have a premium capacity, we'll tend to use Power Automate to issue Power BI refreshes more frequently. But we still need to know if that Power Automate flow that's issuing the refreshes to Power BI dataset is actually running. And especially if you're running a large team and you got a lot of Power Automate flows, you kind of want to know when that's occurring. Let me, of course, it's opening on the wrong screen, but I will fix that here in just a second. All right, let me just custom connector test. All right, load that. It's going to take a second to, it's loading right now, so I'm going to try to click and drag it over to the screen. But what we ran into is there wasn't a way in Power BI to connect to Power Automate and tell us, all right, what flows are running, when are they running, have they run well? And a lot of solutions, especially on the Power Platform, now that you're integrating Power BI with Power Apps and Power Automate, kind of want one place to monitor, or at least try to consolidate a way to look at all these changes that are going on and seeing if anything's failing. Because now that we have Power BI connectors or visuals that you can kick off a Power Automate flow or embed Power Apps directly into Power BI, the more integrated and coupled these solutions are, the more there is a need to know when any piece of that solution breaks. So it's asking me to sign in real quick. I could probably just change my share on my screen and that will just be easier. I'm going to share my main desktop. It's over. All right, so I have a Power Automate REST API commercial connector. It's asking me to sign in. And what it's going to do now is not only go out to the Power BI REST API and grab the information about the data set refreshes and any of the data sets that exist in the workspace and the schedules, it'll actually also go out to Power Automate and check to see any of the Power Automate flows that are running that I have access to. So again, if you have to have somebody either share the Power Automate flow with you, or you have built that Power Automate flow yourself, then you have visibility into those flows and see whether or not they passed or failed. And so this template, as soon as it finishes loading, it usually goes a lot quicker when I'm not using Teams. But you can see here it's loading the refreshes, it's loading the data sets. It's going to be loading probably the Power Platform environments and the Power Automate flows, which seem to have run a little quicker. Yep, so it loaded all the flow runs that we have here. And the template should now pull up the version that has the Power Automate components as well into it. All right, I got a bunch of Power BI stuff running, so that's probably why it's running a little slow. All right, so now you can see there's two new boxes down here, schedule flow failures and manual flow failures. Under the hood, if we take a look at the Power Query component now, it has a section for Power Automate. And just like the catalog that that we had for Power BI, this is a much smaller list, but it'll get you all the environments that you have, and then you can pull the personal flows, the team flows, and the flow runs. And so you can see here what it's trying to do is you pass in an environment ID and you any optional parameters, like you can pass in, give me the top 10, and you'll see in a version of this function as I go here, all I do is I'll pull in the environments that I have available to me, do the conversion, and then I just filter. You can see all the environments I have access to. Now, if you're doing Power Apps development or Power Automate development, and you're using solutions and you have whole pipelines in your Power Power Apps environment, you'll see multiple rows here. But I just have one in this version of the tenant I'm using. So I got my default one. I'll get that information, standardize the column names, and now I have my environments. And now that I understand what my environment ID is, I can get my Power Automate flows, get a kind of listing of all the Power Automate flows that I have either shared with me or available, and you can see what the status is. So if anybody had like stopped or started them, this is a nice to know if somebody accidentally suspended a flow that you need that's issuing refreshes to Power BI. This is a way that you can check that. And then you can also get a listing of all the Power Automate flow runs and whether or not they've been successful. So you can see here, I actually have something running every couple hours that you can see when the start time was. You can see the end time. It's all in UTC, and then this template converts it to the time zone of your choice. And then it'll give you the status as well. And then from there, you can do other calculations like how long is it taking it to run, but you can get a listing of anything that's failed or succeeded as well. So this is a good way of kind of identifying any of the Power Automate flows that you have that maybe are related to Power BI, issuing refreshes, or dependent on your whole solution. We're starting to bring in that information. So as a workspace admin, if you've got Power BI reports that are being refreshed, you have Power Automate components that are refreshing those data sets or reliant on, both of them are reliant on each other. Now with this kind of monitoring tool and these two connectors, it can kind of empower you to start running some analytics within Power BI. So I see another question came up from Russell. Do you have plans to integrate your Power BI related reports within the Power Platform COE? It's a great question. I'm not quite sure what you mean by the Power Platform Center of Excellence, Russell.
I'll send you a link.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, we've been using this monitoring tool for a little over 6 months, and we use it internally on a couple of our clients who actually have centers of excellence, and we share those templates internally. But these templates we do provide over GitHub as well. So I appreciate when you send the link. All right. Any other questions?
No, we have a question in the room.
Okay.
Yeah, John, this is Bill again. So when you're showing a user the Power Automate scripts they have access to, is it the developer of the report, or is it the user viewing it in the service? Like, can you pass through the current user that's viewing the report through to the connector, and so it only querying their Power Automate flows or something?
Yeah, the way that the gateway is going to use, it's going to run under the credentials that you registered. So I don't think you could pass through another credential to see. So the way we've had to set it up for different projects is you're going to have one entry for your gateway entry for that like admin who has access to those flows, and then like for your other solution you'll have a different admin. There isn't kind of I think because of the double hop issue, you can't pass the credentials through on behalf of that user.
That's fine, but I could probably query the users of those flows, then I could do role level security and do my own security or something.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, thanks.
Can you pull flow expiration dates? Looking to monitor flows that may expire due to inactivity. I'm actually looking at that. I haven't found a consistent API call that gives me that information. And the reason I say that is for certain schedule flows, and that the only thing I can identify is when it got suspended. I've been trying to look to see if whether I can kind of see it if the credentials get expired, but I haven't been able to find the right API call that actually tells me either consistently. It's gonna be up for disablement due to inactivity, or this power or this automate flow is going to fail because this user's credential is about to expire. I haven't been able to hit the API where it actually tells me that consistently at this point, but I am looking because those are definitely two issues that our teams run into from time to time, both on inactivity with a flow or credentials that are going to expire that are going to cause that flow to fail as well. All right, so the other question I see here is, can you figure out when Power BI refresh will stop due to inactivity? I'm sorry, I was thinking of it from a Power Automate perspective. No, under the Bill, under the current API call that I've seen, it doesn't give you an expiration date, and we can actually double check that because I pull in all the data right now for a data set. So if we were to look at workspace data sets and we go to...
Yeah, I was playing off of Mike's question. Mike had a good question on the flows, but I was curious the same thing on Power Automate refresh. I hate it when they stop and I don't know why, you know.
Yeah, so right now it looks like doesn't look like you get an expiration date. Those are all the properties you get back from the service right now. There is definitely a lot of things in the API that could be made available, and I do have a request for those who are downloading the reports. Let me just get to Power BI ideas. So there's a lot of folks in the community that are working with the APIs and seeing limitations. One of those is like the expiration one. I'm going to have to, or suspension date. That's something I would love to know, Bill. These ones right here, for data flows, you can get whether a data flow's failed but you can't get its schedule. You can get a data set schedule, but you can't get a data flow schedule. So if you click on the link in the, this takes you to Power BI ideas. There's a person out there who's had this idea for a while. Please vote it up because that would be very helpful. There's also number 2, if you have an app, and especially with the new version of the app where you can do multiple audiencing, there's no way to make an API call to get where the pending access requests are. So if you're managing multiple Power BI apps and you want to know like who's requesting what in one location instead of having to click on every app, there's really no way to centralize that right now. And that's a big issue for folks who are managing application, especially the folks that I've worked with. They come from the SharePoint world. You can run a Power Automate flow right now to get the list of all the access requests to a SharePoint site. You can't do that in a Power BI app, which is frustrating. And then the third one on the Power BI idea that I would really love if you click on it, vote it up, is, we went through this whole process of writing a custom connector and making it open source just because we knew there was a gap in this capability for workspace admins. And you have to go through the process of downloading the MES file and getting it loaded onto a gateway. Wouldn't it be nice if this was just inherent in the Microsoft product? So if you could vote that up, my goal would one day is like not having to do this session and explain how to use the connector. They should have the connector available to us. But that only gets addressed if you vote up those issues and make the product team over at Microsoft and Power BI understand that this is something that is important to the community to have this information available through natively through a connector. All right, so I see another question. Any differences in PowerShell and REST in terms of keeping current libraries up to date or version changes? So that's a great question. So right now, the custom connectors that we build, I have like a little monitor that looks for any changes in the Power BI API. Typically, when Microsoft comes out with a new version of the API, I've seen it take a little while for the PowerShell library to maybe pick up on that endpoint. And then the workaround for the endpoint is you can use the invoke Power BI REST method, which is kind of a catch-all, so that if they don't have an actual function implemented yet in PowerShell, you just use the invoke Power BI REST API, and then you got to type out the URL and pass in the right parameters. And so that's been the workaround in PowerShell. Whereas in the custom connector that we built, we just continually monitor to see if the REST APIs are being updated, the endpoints. I don't necessarily have to worry about the JSON that's coming back because we don't parse that. But the endpoints we're keeping an eye on. And I've been looking we've covered a lot of the preview endpoints. The only one that we're still working on, just because it's in preview and not a lot of folks are using it just yet, is the sync. Power BI introduced the ability now that you can have a data set that's in read-write mode and another one in read mode, and kind of have a cache version, and you can run a refresh and then sync that up. That capability has a new endpoint called like dataset/sync. That's not in this custom connector right now, but we'll be implementing that as about the time that it gets to GA.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This one other thing I had a question. I was implementing a lot of this because of data flows that were kind of control points where in the data set you have a bunch of data flows that are kind of running like certain dates or certain things that somebody wants to include in their overall report or their data set. Fiscal years, closing dates, things like that. But then you don't have to refresh the entire data set. Those data flows are little mini pieces of the whole data set, and I tend to run those data flows either manually if it's simple, or running as you would have the Power Apps. But is there down at the data flow level? And the other thing is, so there's that piece, and then the other thing was confusing is you key something up to run or refresh, and it would wait, and you think, what in the hell's going on? It's like something happened inside the tenant, or there's a whole bunch of resources that are being used by other people or got started before you did. So you're in a holding queue. You're in a queue waiting to run. You're
Yep.
keyed up to run, but you're not even running yet.
Yep.
It seemed as though the information, the UI piece, if you look at the UI, was kind of deceptive. Do these REST APIs give you kind of a better handle on what the real status of, is it really running or is it waiting type of thing? So there's two questions there.
Yeah. I guess in short, the answer is no. It's only going to tell you when you call it whether or not it's in progress, failed, or completed. There is some, if you're using the enhanced refreshed API, you can get some additional information out of the data set, or the data flow that will tell you like exactly like what components, what were being refreshed. It's not at the level that I would say log analytics is going to give you if you're really trying to figure out what your queue line is for your refreshes at this point.
You think if you're really getting a handle on this stuff, there's a notion of being in a kind of a a premium capacity versus, kind of being in with everybody else in the kitchen sink, and there's a noisy neighbor that's taking all the resources that you don't really have visibility to. What's the, in the enterprise world, when you're betting the farm on this, we should actually be in a premium capacity world. Do you think, or what are your feelings on that?
Well, it depends on how big your organization is, but typically for larger environments that I've worked with, we tend to have multiple premium capacities. But even if you have, let's say you have a large, very large Power BI data sets, maybe you had analysis services and you're moving those to Power BI. If you know those are going to be behemoths in terms of their size, they're going to be large data models. It is usually good practice from a development standpoint to separate your premium capacities. You want to keep them maybe similar, but you'll have the one for the production version, and then you have the one for the test version, so that when you have folks who have a test workspace and they're, maybe they're running a crazy query, they're doing something with direct query that is just hosing the premium capacity, the production team or the production capacity isn't impacted. I've seen situations where if you're running it on the same capacities, and you're kind of tipping at that point, you could easily have a test or dev kind of person working on a very large data set impact production, which you don't want.
Good point. I gotta fight for that. I think that's a definite need to have that separated, because I think you can get into just ugly situations in a production where the dev guy's in there and not even knew he did a bad thing by kicking off a bad query or a bad set of resources that got used.
And if you want to do it on the cheaper, I mean, I've seen implementations where, production is a premium capacity, but if you don't want to pay as, twice the cost, you could at least get an idea by just having your dev and test folks have PPU, premium per user. And so at least the cost is a little lower for having a test and dev environment. They can have the premium capability so they can build towards what they're going to do in production, but not have to pay double the cost.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep.
John, going back to the expiration for the flows, I may have misunderstood what I saw, but I thought when you first pulled that up, you said that you could see the last runtime of all of the flows. Is that correct?
Yes, you could see.
But then when you pulled up the attribute chart of items that you could see, I didn't see last runtime in there. So I'm curious how you did that. And the reason that this relates to my previous question is if we have last runtime, that we could perhaps create a transform that calculates when it would expire based on the last runtime.
Yeah, I think you could. So what I was showing was a Power BI data set, whether or not it's got an expiration the last time it was refreshed or in use. Now, so you're asking about a Power Automate flow, right?
Correct.
Okay, so yes, you can get data. You can get the Power Automates. Let me just make sure I go to the right one here. You can get the last Power Automate flow runs. So if so like this one, since I refreshed, was updated at 10 UTC. That's when this one last run. If you could get the latest for each version, and I actually do that here. I do a group by. So I know for these data flows, that was the last time that it ran. If there's a formula that you got that says like if this hasn't run in X amount of time, it's going to get disabled. I mean, you could back into that very easily.
I'm pretty sure it's 28 days. Is that right, Dimitri? Do you know? You don't know? Okay.
Usually don't stop prior to that.
Yeah.
Was it 20 or 90? I forgot.
Maybe it's 90. It's one of those. It's nowhere near long enough.
It's awesome. Usually that one critical one that only runs every quarter. It's just right on the cusp.
I had a tendency to create things that would catch really obscure instances and alert me to those obscure things happening. And they only run if that obscure thing happens. So if it doesn't happen for many months in a row, then my alert just goes away.
Yeah. Yeah, I can understand that. But yeah, I mean, you can get the latest information, so at least you could back into it. I'm not the one thing you would have to keep in mind is I think there's a cutoff on the API in terms of how far back it goes. Maybe it's 90 days. So like you could at least keep a list. What I would suggest you keep a list of like all the workflows or the flows that you need to monitor, have that list there, and then just keep in mind that you don't want to base the API call on the flow runs. You want to base it off like a static whitelist of the flows that you have. Otherwise, the row will disappear, and then you're back to not knowing that it failed. Now, one thing that we have been looking at on our team is all these have date and timestamps on them, and so as soon as like our Microsoft makes the custom connectors available to data flows, doing incremental refreshes is going to be really nice. Then you could actually keep history longer. So most data flows, you can just do a start and end range, and you can just say, hey, give me the data for this time period and then keep the rest of the data. So there's a really like high probability that with that feature allowing data flows to use custom connectors, incremental refreshes can start keeping longer, bigger chunks of data there for you to do some more longer term analysis.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, hey, John, great presentation as always. Let's give
Awesome.
John a round of applause.
Awesome.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. Great questions.
That was really good. Somebody who's done a lot of work in Power BI. I appreciate that. Your presentation a lot.
You're welcome.
And I also put a link in the chat for my GCC friends. There's a link for Microsoft Premium Capacitor Monitor. So that link's in the chat as well. It's a great blog I found for the Government Community Cloud. So that's in the chat. Upcoming sessions. But these are the upcoming sessions we have planned out. Anything else, Dimitri, you want to mention on this one?
Yep. So the sessions will be both in person as well as online. So if you come in person, we have food and community and a raffle. But of course, if you can't make it in person, we are streaming online as well.
Yep. And yeah, we have a good schedule for the year. So looking forward to it. Call for speakers. As always, we're here to help work with you. If you have any topic, no matter how short or long, please reach out to us. If you want to review a topic with us or do any sharing with us, we're definitely here to help you present the topic. We can even co-present if you need help. So let us know. Upcoming community events. Microsoft 365 conference. I think, Dimitri, you mentioned you're going to be out there.
Yep. Is anyone else going to the conference?
In Las Vegas. Our premium sponsor will be there. No? Okay. European, that's even further. 365 EdCon, is that a free one? That's
I don't believe any of these are.
no, none of these are free, right? Okay. And then Microsoft Inspired, still waiting on the date on that one. Are we missing any events anybody know of? In the room or online? Okay. These are the P&P online events. I join these a lot. I adjusted these times here for Eastern Standard Time, but if you go to the URL, they're in the Pacific time and UTC time. Really highly recommend going on these calls. If you get to them 5-10 minutes early, it's a good opportunity to ask questions. All these videos are online, but joining them gives you that chat session like today. You can, have a conversation online. Really worth it. And also Women IT Pros and Power Addicts. These are some of the other ones that we recommend. Related user groups. I think Rhode Island, I think a lot of the user groups are now active lately, right? I know one of them wasn't, and then.
Yeah, I mean during the pandemic, a lot of these user groups have really slowed down. Some never came back. Others have online or hybrid or in person. So if there's interest, definitely check out their individual URLs for their next meetings.
Boston Azure group's really interesting. Sometimes they're in Cambridge and Boston. So feel free to check those groups out. And Automate group, I'm going to be trying that group myself. So and this is the part of the any questions or tips, we open up to the room. So I want to open up the room. Any questions or tips? And anybody online? Have any questions or?
Well, there was a previous question about the Teams business versus personal login switch that you had asked to table to the end of the session. I don't know if that person is still online. And
I'm still here. This is Tim. It's I work with a bunch of folks at within the Microsoft domain, and they have both personal and work accounts. I have in my own domain my personal and work accounts, but I found flipping between Windows and Mac, Windows 11 and the Mac. I'm running an M1 latest Ventura, and there's a little bit of difference in terms of how they're, how you can log in and have, like on the Windows, you can have a work and a personal, both teams, and kind of flip back and forth. And there's some little unique things like whiteboarding and other things and calls and that are a little bit different. But in the Mac version, I'm just having difficulty even getting a connection where if I'm in work, I want to flip over to personal. It's not like it is on Windows. And I was just wondering if anybody else had experienced something similar, or maybe I could get with them and kind of share what my pain is. Doesn't sound like though.
Yeah, I mean, are there any Mac experts in the room or online?
I have a Mac. I haven't noticed too much frustration. I do switch. Sometimes I log out and log in if I want to not be a guest of the tenant. So on Teams you're talking about?
Yeah, it's that, and the whole OneDrive scenario as well. You got kind of, you have a personal OneDrive and you got a work one that's tied in a little bit different. So I think I'm just misusing it, and I was just maybe I just wanted to talk to somebody who may have had something similar and see if they come up with a.
I'm using them both, no problem. I do recommend making sure your OneDrive software is up to date. That's usually solves most of your problems. But I have my Microsoft personal account, I have my work account, the user group account. I got like 3 or 4 blue clouds at the bottom and 1 white one. So and on the Mac.
Yeah, that's that same here. That's just to kind of keep them. When I save a file coming through the Mac as opposed to on Windows, where did it go? It ended up in the iCloud instead. So whatever.
So when you sync on the Mac, you do want to think about where you store that file. So even like on the PC, on the Mac, you kind of have a choice where the files reside, and you could have them reside in your iCloud. Now you're using 2 clouds. You're syncing down to your machine, then they go.
I know.
So I don't recommend that. So I usually I make sure they're not in my iCloud folder.
Yeah, you can do the same thing on the PC version. You can redirect where a library is stored. You can have it set up where it's stored in a location that is also synced by another product.
Yes.
So there are some
in the Mac makes it too
fun
easy.
Things that you can do with this, and some horrific things that can happen as well.
So I find that on the Mac, I don't
cross your OneDrive and Google Drive.
Yeah, and I found that on the Mac, it likes to default the document to that OneDrive, the iTunes sync. So be careful with that.
That's probably what's happening. I just get frustrated. I say, well, I save it, then I end up moving it so I can find it. If I'm, I like to work between the different machines, and I haven't got it all sorted out, the working best practice. So that's probably what's going on. I've got too many syncs going on, different things.
But yeah, I would recommend that. The same thing like on the PC, what I do is I unsync the library so that those little symbols go away, the sync in the cloud, and then I can delete that folder and then do a new sync. Whenever I do run into a problem, I make sure my OneDrive is logged in. I check that the syncs are working. I look at the settings list. But yeah, regardless Mac or PC, you want to know that location where it's storing the files. So.
Okay.
Any other questions in the room or online? Mike, you have a question in the room?
So I've got one. This is, it might be a little advanced, but I'll try to simplify it as much as possible. In Power Apps, I have a drop-down column, and what I'm trying to do is have it set so that the choice of that drop-down column determines what connections are used in that app.
So unlike a cascading, you want like a, but
Yeah.
it does a connection.
So for example, imagine you have like a drop down and then a gallery, right? And the gallery displays items from one SharePoint list if the value in the drop down is one thing, but it displays from a completely different list if it's in another thing. So
What those
I know
are.
I know how to do that, but what I really want to do is have it set so that when I make that change, it actually creates the connections themselves. Because the problem is, again, I simplified it for this. There's actually, that drop-down list is affecting 7 different connections that happen all at once. So what I don't want is the Power App to have 7 different connections times the number of values that I have in that drop-down list, and it just using each of those. I know how to do it that way, but I wanted to make the connection based on that.
Like you try to have the visual layer drive the logical layer.
Yeah, it sounds like a low-code solution. You might need a full-code solution.
Yeah, because in low code, you know, your visual, your logic layers, they tend not to intermingle.
I can't find any, even in a full code situation, I can't find anything that will create the connection.
Well, if you build like a SharePoint framework web part, you can decide when you want to bind the connections. And you can do that at any point based on interactions or loads or what have you.
Okay,
Gotta go code.
referencing something I don't understand at all, but I appreciate the analogy.
I know, I mean, like there's certainly limitations to any of the low-code, no-code platforms.
Yeah.
And what you're describing is going to be an edge case that's going to be a little over the edge.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Thought I'd throw it out there.
Yeah, I mean, low code environment, they tend to separate those layers. So they
It's
can't
not
intermingle.
code. Oh my God.
It is low code.
It's not.
I know, it doesn't feel it. It doesn't feel
If
it.
your low-code solution looks like it's a high-code solution,
Yeah.
you've probably overstepped the boundary. Goes to backboard.
There you go. All right, any other
I
questions?
think just in the interest of time, I mean, we could talk more like after.
Yes, we can.
But
We'll be going off
we could have
drinks
space until
afterwards. Any other questions online?
It's where we get booted out of.
So we'll make sure everybody online's getting, you know, you feel free to unmute yourself, ask any questions, otherwise we can wrap it up.
I want to personally say thank you. I haven't been for quite some time, and I was very pleased to attend this one. And many thanks to John for his time spent preparing for this meeting. So thank you, John.
You're welcome.
All right, and a huge thank you to Turn Digital, providing us with the food and helping coordinate the space and keeping the user group growing. So thank you so much. And also thank you to our past sponsors of the user group.